There are three phrases in the Bible that sound almost harmless. They are not curses. They are not blasphemies shouted inside a pagan temple. They are not the words of Pharaoh, not the words of Jezebel, not the words of Rome. They are the words of God's own people. Words spoken by people who had seen the Red Sea open. Words spoken by people who had eaten bread from heaven. Words spoken by people who had walked beneath a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And yet those words angered God. One phrase looked back and called slavery better. If only we had died in Egypt. One phrase looked at God's daily provision and called it worthless. We detest this miserable food. And one phrase stood at the edge of the promised land, looked at the giants, looked at the fortified cities, looked at the fruit of the promise in their own hands and said, "We cannot go up." Three phrases, three moments, one buried generation. But the most disturbing part is this: these were not just ancient complaints from a people wandering in the wilderness. They are words we still repeat every day in different language, in ordinary conversations, in private thoughts, sometimes even inside prayers that sound spiritual. We say, "If only things were like before." We say, "I hate this season." We say, "I cannot change," and we rarely realize how close those words are to the wilderness. So stay with me until the final phrase, because that is where the story takes its sharpest turn. The same wilderness that reveals God's anger will also reveal a bronze serpent lifted high, a strange sign of mercy, and a picture Jesus himself would later connect to the cross. That is the part you do not want to miss, because this story does not only show how words can expose unbelief, it shows how God provides a way for poisoned hearts to live again. So before we enter the wilderness, subscribe for more Bible history explained with reverence, context, and depth. And comment these three words below: watch your words. Share this with someone walking through a wilderness season. Because sometimes the first step out of unbelief is not a louder miracle. It is a different sentence. Before we hear the first phrase, we have to enter the world where it was spoken, a world where freedom felt more terrifying than slavery. Before the first phrase was ever spoken, Israel was standing in a place no generation before them had ever stood. Behind them was Egypt, the empire of brick kilns, forced labor, whips, Pharaoh's decrees, the river that had once swallowed Hebrew sons. And now behind them also lay the broken pride of that empire. The Red Sea had opened, the waters had stood like walls, the slaves had walked through on dry ground, and when Egypt followed, the sea closed over horses, chariots, and soldiers. Israel had seen what no army could do. They had seen the hand of God break the power of Pharaoh. They had seen judgment fall on the gods of Egypt. They had seen night split by fire. They had seen a pillar of cloud move before them by day, a pillar of fire burn above them by night. They were not people who lacked evidence. They were not people who had never seen God move. They had seen miracles. They had walked inside one, and yet freedom did not feel simple, because freedom had brought them into a place where nothing was familiar. No city walls, no Egyptian storehouses, no predictable meals, no visible army protecting the borders, no map they could control, only sand, wind, heat, thirst, silence, and the strange mercy of a God who could not be managed. Israel had left Egypt, but Egypt had not fully left Israel. Their feet were free, their memories were not. Behind them was slavery, but it was familiar. Ahead of them was promise, but it was unknown. And sometimes the unknown mercy of God feels more terrifying than the predictable cruelty of the past. That is the tension at the heart of the wilderness. God had brought his people out of prison, but their minds still knew how to think like prisoners. They had been delivered from Pharaoh's hand, but they still carried Pharaoh's world inside them. A world where food came from storehouses. A world where security came from power. A world where tomorrow was cruel, but at least it was predictable. The wilderness was different. In the wilderness, they would have to wake up each morning and trust again. Trust for water, trust for bread, trust for direction, trust when the cloud moved, trust when the cloud stopped, trust when the road seemed to lead nowhere. This was not only a journey across land, it was a journey out of a slave imagination, because God was not only taking Israel out of Egypt, he was taking Egypt out of Israel. And that work was slower, deeper, more painful. The Red Sea could be crossed in one night. But fear does not leave the human heart so quickly. A chain can fall from the wrist in a moment. But the memory of slavery can remain for years, and this is where the story begins to feel uncomfortably close. Because many people know what it is like to be brought out of something but not yet healed from it. God can bring someone out of an old season, an old relationship, an old pattern, an old fear, an old identity, and still, when life becomes difficult, the heart starts looking backward. Not because the past was good, but because the past was known. We begin to remember the old place without remembering the chains. We remember the comfort and forget the cost. We remember the food and forget the bondage. We remember predictability and forget the pain. That is how fear edits memory. And in the Bible, memory is never a small thing. Memory is a battlefield of faith. If Israel remembered rightly, they would see the wilderness as the next chapter of deliverance. But if they remembered wrongly, they would see the wilderness as proof that God had abandoned them. The same desert, the same heat, the same hunger, the same thirst, but two completely different interpretations. One interpretation says, God brought us here to teach us trust. The other says, God brought us here to let us die. And that difference begins in memory. What happens when God frees your body, but your fear still belongs to Egypt? What happens when your feet are walking toward promise, but your imagination keeps returning to chains? What happens when God gives you freedom, but freedom feels less comfortable than slavery? That is the hidden crisis of Israel in the wilderness. They were not only afraid of the desert, they were afraid of a God they could not control. In Egypt, Pharaoh was cruel, but Pharaoh was visible. In the wilderness, God was faithful, but he was mysterious. He led by cloud and fire. He fed them one day at a time. He did not give them enough information to stop trusting him. He gave them enough mercy to keep following him. And that is often where faith becomes difficult. Not when God is absent, but when God is present in a way we cannot manage. Israel was free, but freedom required trust. Egypt was cruel, but it was familiar. And sometimes familiarity feels safer than faith. That is why the first phrase did not come from atheists. It did not come from people who had never seen God move. It came from people who had seen the sea open, who had watched heaven lead them by fire, who had been rescued from Pharaoh's hand. But when fear rose inside them, they trusted their memory of Egypt more than the God who delivered them. And the first phrase was about to rise from the camp, a sentence that sounded like grief, a sentence that sounded like exhaustion, a sentence that sounded almost understandable, but beneath it was something far more dangerous. If only we had died in Egypt. The first phrase rose from the camp after the spies returned from Canaan. They had seen the land, they had seen the fruit, they had seen the promise with their own eyes. But they had also seen the walls, the fortified cities, the strong people, the descendants of Anak, and fear moved through Israel faster than faith. By night, the camp was no longer filled with songs of deliverance. It was filled with weeping. Mothers held their children. Old men stared into the dark. Families whispered inside their tents. And the sentence began to spread from mouth to mouth. If only we had died in Egypt. Or even, if only we had died in this wilderness. It sounded like grief, but it carried accusation. It sounded like exhaustion, but underneath it was unbelief. It sounded like fear. But fear was not all that was speaking, because Israel did not simply say, "We are afraid." They did not simply say, "The giants are too large." They did not simply say, "We do not know what to do." They said, "It would have been better if we had died in Egypt." That is what makes the sentence so dark. Egypt was not a home. Egypt was a furnace. Egypt was forced labor. Egypt was the sound of whips, bricks, and buried sons. Egypt was the place where Pharaoh ordered Hebrew babies to be thrown into the Nile. Egypt was the place where the people cried out under the weight of slavery. Egypt was the place God judged with plagues, darkness, blood, and death. And yet, in the wilderness, fear edited their memory. The place God called bondage, they began to remember as safety. The place God judged, they began to describe as better than his promise. The place God rescued them from, they began to call preferable to the road of faith. That is what fear does. It does not only exaggerate the future, it rewrites the past. It takes chains and calls them security. It takes slavery and calls it stability. It takes the old pain and covers it with the warm color of nostalgia. And suddenly, the life God rescued you from starts looking better than the wilderness God is leading you through. This was not innocent memory. This was memory without truth. And memory without truth can become rebellion. Because hidden inside that phrase was a charge against God. If only we had died in Egypt really meant, you should not have brought us here. It meant, your deliverance has failed us. It meant, the past we knew was better than the future you promised. It meant, death in slavery would have been better than life by faith. That is why this phrase angered God. Not because his people were tired, not because they felt fear, not because pain itself is sinful. The Bible is filled with honest cries, laments, tears, and prayers from people who suffer. God is not angered by weakness that runs to him. But this was different. This was weakness turning backward. This was fear accusing the deliverer. This was a rescued people calling their rescue a mistake. And before we judge Israel too quickly, we should ask how often pain has edited our own memory. Because we say it differently now, we do not usually say, if only we had died in Egypt. We say, life was easier before I obeyed God. We say, maybe I should have stayed where I was. We say, at least the old life was predictable. We say, I wish things were like they used to be. We say, if I had not taken that step of faith, maybe I would not be suffering now. Sometimes we even say it inside prayers that sound spiritual. Lord, why did you bring me into this season? Why did you open this door if it would be this hard? Why did you lead me here if I would feel this alone? And sometimes those questions are honest. Sometimes they are prayers of pain. Sometimes they are the words of someone who is tired, wounded, and confused. But sometimes honesty becomes dangerous when it forgets the truth. Because not every memory is faithful. Not every if only is innocent. Not every longing for the past is wisdom. Sometimes the past becomes dangerous when pain edits the memory. That is the first phrase. Not a curse word, not a pagan chant, not open blasphemy from an enemy of God. It was nostalgia without truth. It was a rescued people remembering slavery as though it had been shelter. And that is why the wilderness story still speaks so sharply, because there are moments when God brings us out of something old, but the new road becomes hard. And when the new road becomes hard, the heart starts decorating Egypt. It remembers the food, but forgets the chains. It remembers the familiar rhythm, but forgets the crushing weight. It remembers what was predictable, but forgets what was destroying us. That is why faith must learn to remember honestly. To remember not only what we miss, but what God saved us from. To remember not only the comfort, but the cost. To remember not only the old pleasure, but the old bondage. Because if memory loses truth, nostalgia can become rebellion. And the first phrase that angered God was not a curse word. It was not shouted in a temple of idols. It was spoken by his own people in the dark of the wilderness. If only we had died in Egypt. A sentence that sounded like sadness. But beneath it, they were calling chains better than promise. They were calling slavery safer than faith. They were calling the past more trustworthy than the God who had opened the sea. But Israel did not only look backward and call slavery better. Soon they would look down at a miracle lying on the ground, bread from heaven, daily mercy beneath their feet, and call it worthless. Morning came over the wilderness, slowly, quietly. The night wind faded. The tents began to stir. Children opened their eyes. Fathers stepped outside. Mothers gathered baskets. And across the ground, like frost beneath the desert sun, there it was again, manna. Bread where bread should not exist. No farmer had planted it. No baker had prepared it. No caravan had delivered it. No Egyptian storehouse had supplied it. The wilderness had no fields, no ovens, no market, no harvest. And yet every morning the wilderness became a table. God had not only brought Israel out of Egypt, he was feeding them in a place that could not feed them. He was sustaining life in a land that offered death. He was giving bread where bread had no natural reason to appear. Manna was not just food. It was a daily argument against despair. It was God saying, "You are still here because I am still faithful." It came every morning. They called it ordinary. It kept them alive. They called it miserable. At first it must have felt like wonder, a miracle beneath their feet, a reminder that the God who opened the sea could also cover the ground. But over time, wonder became routine. Routine became boredom, and boredom became contempt. The miracle did not stop. Their amazement did. The bread still came. Their gratitude faded. The provision continued. But their hearts stopped seeing it as holy. And then Israel said the unthinkable, "There is no bread or water, and we detest this miserable food." Listen to the contradiction. There is no bread, while bread from heaven was lying on the ground. They were not starving. They were despising the way God chose to feed them. They were not abandoned. They were offended by the form of God's provision. They did not say, "Lord, help us." They did not say, "Lord, we are tired." They did not say, "Lord, teach us to trust you one more day." They said, "We detest this. We hate what you gave us. We are tired of the mercy that has kept us alive." This is why the second phrase is so serious. The first phrase looked backward and called slavery better. The second phrase looked at the present and called grace worthless. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because most of us do not reject God's provision loudly. We do not stand in the desert and curse manna from heaven. We simply stop seeing it as holy. We stop marveling. We stop noticing. We stop receiving. And then the thing that once felt like mercy starts to feel like not enough. The job that pays the bills becomes this boring job. The family we prayed for becomes these people who exhaust me. The quiet season God uses to form us becomes nothing is happening. The daily strength that gets us through becomes something we barely acknowledge. The roof over our head, the breath in our lungs, the food on the table, the ordinary mercy of another morning. We do not always reject God's gifts by throwing them away. Sometimes we reject them by losing the ability to marvel. That is what happened with manna. A miracle became a routine became a burden became an accusation, and the people who were being carried began to complain about the way they were being carried. The most dangerous miracles are not always the ones God refuses to give. Sometimes the most dangerous miracles are the ones we receive so often that we stop seeing them. Manna was designed to teach dependence, but dependence is uncomfortable for people who want control. God gave them enough for today. They wanted enough to feel safe without trusting tomorrow. God gave them daily bread. They wanted a system that made faith unnecessary. God gave them provision. They wanted predictability, and this is the hidden conflict beneath their complaint. It was not only about food, it was about control, because manna could not be managed the way Egypt could be managed. In Egypt, the storehouses were visible. The system was brutal, but it was organized. You knew where the food came from. You knew who controlled it. You knew the rules of survival. But manna was different. Manna required humility. Every morning they had to bend down. Every morning they had to gather. Every morning they had to receive what God had chosen to give. And every morning they had to trust that tomorrow He would do it again. That is not how proud hearts want to live. We want enough stored up so we do not have to feel dependent. We want the blessing without the daily surrender. We want provision without vulnerability. But the wilderness does not work that way. The wilderness teaches daily trust. Not because God is cruel, but because trust cannot be learned only in abundance. Sometimes trust is formed when there is just enough for today. And that is why gratitude is not a shallow emotion. Gratitude is spiritual resistance. It refuses to let entitlement rename mercy as misery. It refuses to let boredom turn provision into contempt. It refuses to let the heart say, "This is nothing," when God is using that very thing to keep you alive. A daily miracle can become invisible when entitlement replaces gratitude. And Israel's second phrase shows us what happens when invisible mercy becomes despised mercy. They looked at bread from heaven and called it worthless. They looked at daily provision and called it a burden. They looked at the food God gave and said, "We detest this miserable food." But the story gets darker. First, Israel rewrote the past, then they despised the present. But the most dangerous phrase had not yet been spoken, because the third phrase would not look backward. It would not look down at manna. It would stand at the edge of the promised land, see the fruit of the promise, see the walls of the enemy, hear the report of fear, and close the door to the future. We cannot go up. They were standing at the edge of the promise. This was the moment everything had been moving toward. Egypt was behind them. The Red Sea was behind them. Sinai was behind them. The wilderness road had led them to this border. For generations, God had spoken of a land. a land promised to Abraham, a land flowing with milk and honey, a land not built by Israel's strength, but given by God's covenant. And now, they were close enough to send men inside, 12 spies, 12 leaders, 12 pairs of eyes sent to see the land God had already promised. They crossed into Canaan, they walked through valleys, they saw fields, they saw fruit, they saw the shape of the promise. And when they returned, they did not come back empty-handed. They came back carrying fruit, not rumors, not theories, not religious imagination. Fruit. The promise was not invisible. It had weight. It could be touched. It could be carried. A cluster of grapes so large it had to be carried on a pole between two men. The land was real. The promise was real. The goodness of God was not a vague idea. It was hanging in front of them in the form of fruit. For one brief moment, the camp could have erupted in worship. They could have said, "The Lord has spoken truth." They could have said, "The land is exactly as He promised." They could have said, "The God who opened the sea has brought us to the gate." But then came the word that changed everything. But the land is good, but the people are strong. The fruit is real, but the cities are fortified. The promise is beautiful, but the walls are high. God has been faithful, but the giants are too large. That word became the breaking point. But it turned testimony into terror. It turned evidence into anxiety. It turned fruit into fear. And finally, the report hardened into a sentence. "We cannot go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are." One report. 10 fearful voices. One night of weeping. One generation turned back. This third phrase is the most dangerous because it sounds so reasonable. It does not sound like rebellion at first. It sounds like wisdom. It sounds like caution. It sounds like strategy. It sounds like someone looking at the numbers, measuring the walls, studying the enemy, and making a practical decision. We cannot go up. And if you remove God from the story, they were probably right. The cities were fortified. The people were strong. The descendants of Anak were intimidating. Israel was not an empire. They had no great siege machines. They had no long history of organized warfare. They had been slaves, wanderers, a people living in tents. So from the ground level, the fear made sense. But that was the problem. They were judging the future from the ground level only. They calculated the walls. They calculated the giants. They calculated their own weakness. But they did not calculate the faithfulness of God. They were not wrong about the giants. They were wrong about God. Their problem was not that they saw the danger. Their problem was that they saw only the danger. Joshua and Caleb saw the same land. They saw the same walls. They saw the same people. They heard the same report. But they refused to let the obstacle become larger than the promise. They did not pretend Canaan was empty. They did not say there would be no battle. They did not deny that the cities were strong. Faith is not pretending the giants are small. Faith is remembering that God is greater, and that is where Israel broke. The fruit of the promise was in their hands, but the fear of giants was in their hearts. They had physical evidence of God's goodness before their eyes, but their imagination was ruled by the enemy. They could carry the grapes, but they could not carry the promise. They could see the land, but they could not trust the God who gave it. And this is the terrifying lesson. Sometimes the sentence that destroys your future does not sound rebellious. It sounds realistic. Sometimes unbelief does not say, "I reject God." Sometimes unbelief says, "I am just being practical. I am just being honest. I am just looking at the facts." And facts matter. Wisdom matters. Discernment matters. The Bible does not celebrate foolishness. But there is a kind of realism that becomes unbelief when it counts every obstacle and forgets every miracle. It remembers the giants but forgets the sea. It remembers the walls but forgets the plagues. It remembers human weakness but forgets divine faithfulness. That was Israel's crisis. Not lack of information, lack of holy memory. They had enough history to trust God. But fear shouted louder than memory, and fear is contagious. A single fearful report can move through a community like fire through dry grass. One voice trembles, another repeats it. A family begins to whisper. A tent begins to weep. A tribe begins to panic. Soon an entire camp is not discussing promise. They are discussing death. The report of 10 men became the imagination of a nation, and by night the people were crying out again. Not quietly, not privately. The whole congregation lifted up their voices. They wept through the night. Then the fear grew darker. They did not only say, "We cannot enter." They began to say, "We should choose another leader." They began to speak of going back to Egypt. Do you see the pattern? The first phrase looked backward. If only we had died in Egypt. The second phrase despised the present. We detest this miserable food. The third phrase rejected the future. We cannot go up. Past, present, future. Fear touched all of it. It rewrote what God had saved them from. It despised what God was giving them now, and it refused what God had promised ahead. That is why this third sentence was not merely negative thinking. It was covenant collapse. It was a people standing at the threshold of promise and saying, God is not enough for what stands in front of us. We say it differently now. I cannot change. My family cannot heal. God cannot use someone like me. This problem is too big. This calling is beyond me. This door is too risky. This obedience will cost too much. Sometimes those words feel humble, but they may be hiding a dangerous assumption that the size of the obstacle matters more than the faithfulness of God. Fear becomes unbelief when it makes God smaller than the obstacle. That does not mean we deny difficulty. It means difficulty does not get the final word. That does not mean we ignore wisdom. It means wisdom must remember God, because there is a difference between counting the cost and burying the promise. There is a difference between discernment and disguised fear. There is a difference between saying, "This will be hard," and saying, "God cannot lead me through it." Israel crossed that line, and once they crossed it, the whole camp changed. The fruit that should have awakened worship became evidence in a trial against hope. The promised land stood before them, but their words closed the gate. They saw the fruit of the promise in their hands, but the fear of giants in their hearts. And after that sentence spread through the camp, the wilderness became silent. Because this time, God did not answer first with manna, not with water, not with another sign, not with another reassurance to calm their fear. After all the miracles, after the sea, after the bread from heaven, after the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire, God answered with a sentence. And then God answered, not with another miracle first, not with more manna, not with more water, not with another sign to calm their fear. This time, He answered with judgment. The people had said, "If only we had died in Egypt." They had said, "We detest this miserable food." They had said, "We cannot go up." And now the Lord spoke over the generation that had seen His power, but refused His promise. They would not enter the land. The land was still real. The promise was still true. The fruit was still good. Canaan had not become impossible. The giants had not become stronger than heaven. God's arm had not grown weak. His covenant had not failed. But the generation that had been rescued from Egypt refused to trust the God who rescued them. So the road became a circle. The journey that should have moved forward began to turn back on itself, day after day, month after month, year after year. The wilderness became their home, and then, slowly, it became their grave. They had said, "We will die in the wilderness." And the wilderness received their bodies. They had said, "Our children will become prey." But those children would be the ones God preserved. They had said, "It would have been better to die," and one by one their words became history. This is not because words are magic. This is not because one sentence has power apart from the heart. Their words did not create their unbelief. Their words revealed it. Their mouths spoke what fear had already built inside them. Their complaints were not random sounds floating through the desert air. They were confessions, confessions of what they believed when the promise became difficult, confessions of what they trusted when the giants looked large, confessions of what they remembered when the past began to glow brighter than the truth. They had seen the sea open. They had eaten bread from heaven. They had followed cloud and fire. They had watched God defeat Egypt. But when the moment came to trust Him forward, they turned backward, and the cost was 40 years. 40 days of spying became 40 years of wandering, 1 day for 1 year, 1 report, 1 night of weeping, 1 generation buried. Morning after morning manna still fell, night after night the pillar still stood, season after season. The camp moved through the same wilderness, and year after year the sand received another grave. Imagine the children who once heard their parents cry, "We will die here." They grew up watching those words become true. They watched the adults who had feared the future disappear into the dust of the present. They learned the shape of unbelief not from a book, but from burial places. Every grave in the wilderness became a warning. Every funeral whispered, "Do not call slavery better than promise. Do not call manna worthless. Do not call God smaller than the giants." And yet, even here, the story is not simple, because God did not abandon his covenant. He did not erase his promise. He did not forget Abraham. He did not give Canaan to another people. Joshua still lived. Caleb still lived. The children still lived. The promise waited. That is the painful mercy inside the judgment. The wilderness was not only the place where one generation was punished, it was also the place where the next generation was protected from inheriting the same unbelief. God's judgment was severe, but his covenant remained. His anger was real, but his faithfulness did not disappear. The promise did not fail. The unbelieving generation failed to enter it. That is the weight of this moment. God was not unable to bring them in. They were unwilling to trust him enough to enter. And there is a difference, a terrible difference, a holy difference. They stood at the edge of promise with fruit in their hands and fear in their hearts. They spoke death over the wilderness, and the wilderness became their grave. But if the story ended here, it would only be a warning, a severe warning, a needed warning, but still only a warning. The Bible gives us something deeper, something stranger, something far more merciful. Because in the same wilderness where their words brought judgment, God would lift up a sign that turned judgment into a doorway of grace. It would come through pain, through poison, through cries in the camp, through death in the sand, and through one bronze image lifted high enough for the dying to see. Then came one of the strangest scenes in the wilderness. After all the graves, after all the wandering, after all the mercy they had already received, Israel spoke against God again. They looked at the road God had chosen and called it death. They looked at the bread that had kept them alive and called it miserable. They said, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness?" There was no gratitude in the sentence, no trust, no memory of the sea, no wonder over manna, no fear of the God who had carried them this far, only accusation again. The complaint that once sounded like ordinary frustration now stood exposed as poison, and then poison entered the camp. The serpents came through the dust, through the tents, through the places where children slept and families gathered. Cries rose in the camp, one voice, then another, then another. The wilderness filled with the sound of pain. People fell to the ground. Families ran in fear. The same mouths that had spoken against God now gasped for breath. Death moved through the tents like a shadow, and for a moment, the camp that had complained about the road could not escape the ground beneath it. This was judgment. But not the rage of a God losing control, not the anger of a wounded ego, not the impatience of heaven growing tired. God's anger is holy. It is his righteous opposition to the unbelief that destroys his people. He was not angry because they were weak. He was angry because their unbelief was poisoning the very community he was leading toward life, and now the poison had become visible. The wound had been exposed. But this time, Israel did something different. They did not defend themselves. They did not blame Moses. They did not romanticize Egypt. They did not say, "We were only being honest." They said, "We have sinned." For the first time, the words changed. Not accusation, confession, not nostalgia, repentance, not, "Why did you bring us here?" But "We have spoken against the Lord," and Moses prayed, the same Moses they had questioned, the same Moses they had resisted, the same Moses who stood between the people and the judgment they deserved. He prayed, and God answered. But his answer was strange. He did not tell them to cure themselves. He did not tell them to outrun the serpents. He did not tell them to prove they were worthy before healing could come. He told Moses to make a serpent of bronze and lift it high, high enough for the dying to see, high enough for the bitten to look, high enough for a person with poison in their blood to turn their eyes away from the wound and toward the sign God had provided. This was not magic. The bronze serpent was not a charm. It was not a tribal object with power in itself. It was a call to trust. God did not ask the dying to explain every layer of the symbol. He did not ask them to understand the mystery completely. He asked them to look. That was all. Look away from the bite. Look away from the dust. Look away from the panic. Look away from the death moving through the camp. Look at the sign lifted up by God's command, and live. That is the twist at the heart of the story. The serpent, the reminder of judgment, became the place where healing was received. The image of the wound became the doorway to mercy. The sign of death was lifted up so the dying could live. God's anger exposed the wound, but His grace provided the cure, and this is why the final part matters. The wilderness does not only reveal the danger of unbelieving words, it reveals the mercy of a God who still makes a way for poisoned hearts to live again. Centuries later, Jesus would reach back into this wilderness scene. He would speak of Moses. He would speak of the serpent. He would speak of being lifted up. Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. The image is shocking. A serpent, the reminder of judgment, lifted high as the place of healing, and then the cross. The innocent Son of God lifted up in the place of sinners, the Holy One bearing what poisoned humanity could not cure, so that those bitten by the venom of sin, those wounded by unbelief, those dying under the weight of their own rebellion, could look to Him and live. That means the story of the phrases that angered God does not end with death. It does not end with serpents. It does not end with graves in the sand. It points forward to the one lifted up for the world. The same wilderness that exposed their sin also revealed the shape of grace. So now the question changes. It is no longer only, what did Israel say? It is, which of these phrases do we still repeat? Because most of us will never stand at the edge of Canaan. Most of us will never gather manna from desert ground. Most of us will never see a bronze serpent lifted above a dying camp. But we still speak from the same fear. We still remember the past wrongly. We still despise daily mercy. We still look at the future and say, we cannot go up. So what do these three phrases sound like today? Most of us will never stand in the wilderness with Israel. We will not see manna lying on the desert ground. We will not hear the report of spies returning from Canaan. We will not watch Moses lift a bronze serpent above a dying camp. But we know the fear. We know the pressure. We know what it feels like to be between what God brought us out of and what He has not yet brought us into. We know what it feels like to walk through a season where freedom feels uncertain, provision feels ordinary, and the future feels too large. And in those moments, the wilderness phrases begin to sound strangely familiar. Israel said, "If only we had died in Egypt." We say, "Life was easier before this. Maybe I should have stayed where I was. At least the old life was predictable. I wish things were like they used to be. Why did God bring me into this season?" And sometimes the old life only looks peaceful because distance has blurred the chains. We forget the cost. We forget the bondage. We forget the prayers we once prayed when we were begging God to bring us out. That is the first phrase today. It is not always spoken as rebellion. Sometimes it sounds like sadness. Sometimes it sounds like exhaustion. But underneath it, the heart may be asking whether Egypt was safer than the road of faith. Israel said, "We detest this miserable food," we say. "I am tired of this job. I am tired of this season. I am tired of having only enough. Why does my life look so ordinary? Why does everyone else seem to have more? I hate where I am right now." And sometimes we do not realize that what we call only enough may be the manna that kept us alive. The job we complain about may be provision. The quiet season we resent may be formation. The family that exhausts us may still be a gift we once prayed for. The ordinary morning we barely notice may be mercy we did not earn. This does not mean every difficult situation is good. It does not mean pain should be denied. It does not mean we pretend suffering is easy. But it does mean we must be careful not to call God's daily grace worthless just because it does not look like what we wanted, Israel said. We cannot go up, we say. I cannot change. My family cannot heal. God cannot use someone like me. This problem is too large. This calling is too costly. This door is too risky. I am not strong enough. And sometimes those words feel humble, but they may be hiding a dangerous assumption that the size of the obstacle matters more than the faithfulness of God. Faith does not begin by pretending the giants are small. Faith begins by remembering that God is greater. Not every fear is sin. Not every hesitation is rebellion. Not every honest question is unbelief. But fear becomes unbelief when it gets the final word, when it tells you what God cannot do, when it edits your memory, when it despises your manna, when it closes the gate before you ever step forward. The question is not whether you have ever said one of these phrases. The question is which one you say most often. If only, I hate this, I cannot. Each one points to a different battle. The first battle is with the past. Can you remember truthfully what God brought you out of? The second battle is with the present. Can you receive today's grace without despising its form? The third battle is with the future. Can you trust God when the promise stands beside the giants? Your words reveal what your heart believes about God when life becomes uncertain. That is why the wilderness does not only test what you believe, it reveals what you keep saying. So maybe the beginning of faith sounds different. Instead of saying, if only we learn to pray, Lord, help me remember the truth. Instead of saying, I hate this, we learn to pray, teach me to receive today's grace. Instead of saying, I cannot, we learn to pray, if you lead me, I can obey. Not because we are strong, not because the wilderness is easy, not because the giants are imaginary, but because the God who opened the sea, the God who gave manna, the God who lifted a sign of mercy in the wilderness is still faithful. And that brings us to the final question. If our words can reveal unbelief, can they also become the beginning of repentance? The wilderness was not just a place on a map. It was not only sand, not only heat, not only hunger, thirst, and long roads beneath a burning sky. The wilderness was the place where words revealed hearts. Some words looked back and called slavery better. If only we had died in Egypt. Some words looked at manna and called grace miserable. We detest this miserable food. Some words looked at giants and called God too small. We cannot go up, and that is why these phrases angered God, not because he is fragile, not because he cannot handle weakness, not because he is impatient with honest pain. The Bible is filled with tears. It is filled with lament. It is filled with wounded people crying out to God from places they do not understand. But this was different. These words did not run toward God with pain. They turned away from God in unbelief. They called bondage better than deliverance. They called provision worthless. They called promise impossible. And unbelief destroys the very people God is leading toward life. That is what the wilderness exposed. But the wilderness did not only expose sin, it also revealed mercy. Even there, in the same desert where graves marked the sand, God lifted up a sign of healing. The bronze serpent stood above the dying, and centuries later, Christ would be lifted up for the world. So maybe the question is not only, have I said these words? Maybe the deeper question is, what am I teaching my heart to believe every time I speak? When I say, if only am I remembering truthfully? When I say, I hate this, am I despising grace because it came in an ordinary form? When I say, I cannot, am I measuring God's promise? By the size of my fear? The wilderness still asks, not loudly, not angrily, but deeply. What are your words revealing? If this story helped you see the wilderness differently, comment below, watch your words, and tell me which phrase you think people repeat most today. If only I hate this, or I cannot subscribe for more Bible history explained with reverence, context, and depth. And share this with someone walking through a wilderness season, someone who is tired, someone who is tempted to look back, someone who has stopped seeing the manna beneath their feet, someone who is standing before giants and wondering if God is still enough, because sometimes the first step out of unbelief is not a louder miracle, it is a different sentence.